The wind has teeth out here on the plains, and tonight it is starving. It howls across the frozen earth, a predator made of ice and speed, tearing at the canvas of Alara's broken-down wagon. She huddles inside, the threadbare wool of her shawl a pitiful defense against a cold so deep it feels like a personal malice. Her horse, poor Bess, stands with a drooping head, one foreleg held at an unnatural angle, the snap of bone a sound that had been swallowed by the rising shriek of the blizzard. Now, the silence from the animal is more terrifying than any noise. Darkness is falling, not in the gentle way of summer evening, but like a heavy, black sheet being thrown over the world. The snow isn't drifting, it's a horizontal assault, a million tiny knives seeking every gap in her clothing, every crack in a wagon's frame. She is a ship foundering in a white ocean, and the last of her hope is leaking out into the cold. She'd been heading for Willow Creek, for a position as a governess that promised a roof and a wage, a final, desperate gamble after a string of misfortunes had left her with nothing but Bess and the few possessions in this wagon. Now, the wagon was a wreck, Bess was crippled, and Willow Creek might as well be on the moon. She is utterly, terrifyingly alone. That was a close call. Before we see how our heroine navigates this, tell us in the comments, what's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. The cold is no longer just a sensation. It's a presence inside her, slowing her thoughts, making her limbs feel like lead. Survival, which had been a frantic, clawing instinct, is giving way to a strange, drowsy acceptance. It would be so easy to simply close her eyes, to let the white silence take her. But then, through the deafening roar of the wind, comes another sound, a rhythmic heavy thud. It's impossible, a phantom of a freezing mind. But it comes again, closer this time. The sound of a horse, powerful and steady, pushing through the storm. A figure emerges from the swirling white, a silhouette of a man on a large, dark horse, so coated in ice and snow they look like a single, moving statue carved from the blizzard itself. He pulls up beside the wagon, his face obscured by a low-pulled hat and a thick scarf. He leans down, his voice a low rumble that barely cuts through the gale. "You planning on dying out here?" And with a question that held no kindness, only stark reality, his life, and hers, were irrevocably changed. Silas Kane had felt the storm in his bones hours before the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. It was a familiar ache, a reminder of other losses, other winters. His late wife, Mary, had always said he was a better barometer than the one hanging on the porch. He'd spent the afternoon securing the livestock, checking the weak spots in the barn roof, and ensuring the woodpile was high enough to outlast a siege. His daughters, Lily and Daisy, had watched him from the cabin window, their small faces framed by the wavering glass, their world contained within those four log walls. His world was contained there, too. A world of overwhelming responsibility and a silence that was louder than any storm. It had been 2 years since Mary was taken by the fever. 2 years of him trying to be both father and mother to 2 little girls who were growing faster than the wheat in his fields. He was failing. He knew it in the way Lily's hair was always a tangle of knots he couldn't conquer, in the way Daisy's questions about her mother were met with his own clumsy, inadequate silence. He saw it in the mending pile that grew into a mountain on the spare chair, and in the lonely, hollow echo of his own footsteps on the floorboards after the girls were asleep. He was a rancher. He knew the rhythms of the land, the language of horses, the signs of sick calf. He did not know how to braid hair, or sing lullabies, or soothe the quiet grief of a child who missed her mother's touch. The work of the ranch was relentless, demanding every ounce of his strength from before dawn until long after dusk. But it was the work inside the cabin that was truly breaking him. The loneliness was a physical weight, a constant companion in the quiet hours of the night. His daughters needed more than he could give them. They needed a woman's softness, a mother's guidance. It was a stark, painful fact he confronted every single day. That was why he'd ridden out for one last check of the northern fence line, a fool's errand in the face of the storm, but an excuse to escape the suffocating quiet of the cabin for a few more minutes. The wind was a physical blow, and his horse, Titan, fought for every step. He'd been about to turn back when he saw it. The dark, broken shape of the wagon, a man-made wound on the perfect, hostile white of the landscape. He found her huddled inside, barely conscious. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue. For a moment, he thought he was too late. He swung down from Titan, his stiff limbs protesting the cold. He pulled back the canvas flap, and a gust of snow swirled in, dusting her still form. He touched her shoulder, and she flinched, her eyes fluttering open. They were wide with a fear that was quickly being replaced by a chilling apathy. He'd seen that look in the eyes of animals trapped and freezing, the moment they give up the fight. It angered him. "Can you walk?" he barked, his voice rougher than he intended. She shook her head, a barely perceptible movement. He looked at the lame horse, the shattered wagon wheel. She had nothing. She was nothing out here but a body waiting to freeze. Cursing the storm, cursing his own conscience, he knew he couldn't leave her. It wasn't in him. With a grunt, he scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a bundle of bones and cold fabric. He secured her in front of him on Titan's saddle, wrapping his own oilskin coat around her as best he could. She was unresponsive, a dead weight against his chest. The ride back to the cabin was a brutal battle against the elements. Silas shielding the woman's body with his own, his face raw and numb from the ice-laced wind. When he finally stumbled through the cabin door, the warmth and light hit him like a physical blow. Lily and Daisy scrambled up from the hearthrug where they'd been playing with cornhusk dolls. Their eyes grew wide at the sight of the strange woman in their father's arms. "Papa." Lily's voice was sharp with alarm. "Who is that?" "Just a traveler. Caught in the storm," he grunted, carrying Alara over to the hearth and gently lowering her into his own worn armchair. He knelt and began the slow, painful process of pulling off her frozen, stiff boots. Her feet were like blocks of ice. Daisy crept closer, her thumb in her mouth, her expression one of pure, childish curiosity. Lily, ever the guardian, stood back, her arms crossed, her gaze suspicious and unwelcoming. Silas worked methodically, stripping off her wet shawl and gloves, chafing her hands between his own rough, calloused ones until a little color returned. He sent Lily for warm blankets and a bowl of the venison stew that was simmering over the fire. For the first time in a long time, the cabin felt crowded. The presence of this stranger, this woman, had shifted the very air inside, displacing the familiar patterns of their grief and solitude. Alara slowly came around, sipping the hot stew with trembling hands, her eyes darting around the small, rustic room. She took in the rough-hewn table, the stone fireplace that dominated one wall, the two small beds tucked into an alcove, and the two little girls staring at her. Her gaze was like that of a startled deer, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. She saw the mess, the signs of a household run by a man alone, the unswept floor, the jumble of harnesses and tools by the door, the general air of weary functionality. The storm raged for 2 full days. It was an enforced, awkward intimacy. Alara, whose name they learned in a whispered introduction, kept to the chair by the fire, speaking only when spoken to. She was polite, grateful, but wrapped in a cloak of reserve so thick it was almost tangible. Silas watched her. He saw the way her hands, though chapped and raw, were neat and capable. He saw the intelligence in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. He also saw the deep, abiding weariness that seemed to settle in her bones. This was a woman who had been running from something, or to something, for a very long time, and had finally run out of road. Daisy, untroubled by adult complexities, was the first to breach the wall. On the second morning, she toddled over to Alara, holding up one of her cornhusk dolls. "Her name is Mary," she announced solemnly. Alara looked from the doll to the little girl, and for the first time, a genuine, gentle smile touched her lips, transforming her tired face. "That's a beautiful name," she said, her voice soft. She took the doll and straightened its lopsided yarn hair. "Does Mary have a family?" Daisy nodded, pointing a chubby finger. "Papa is the papa, and Lily is the sister. But she doesn't have a mama." The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. Lily, from across the room, shot Alara a look of pure venom before turning her back. Silas, who had been mending a bridle by the window, felt the words like a punch to the gut. He saw the flicker of pain in Alara's eyes, a reflection of his own. In that moment, an idea began to form in his mind. It was a mad idea, born of desperation and the stark reality of the howling wind outside. It was practical. It was transactional. It made a strange, brutal kind of sense. Later that night, after the girls were asleep in their alcove, the cabin was filled only with the crackle of the fire and the scream of the storm. The silence between him and Alara was heavy, thick with unspoken questions. He finally broke it. "What were your plans in Willow Creek?" he asked, not looking at her, focusing instead on the flames. "I had a position," she answered, her voice low, "as a governess." She hesitated. "The letter confirming my employment. It was old. I spent my last funds on the journey. I was praying the position was still open. She didn't have to say more." They both knew the chances of that were slim to none. She was destitute. He finally turned to look at her. She was watching him, her gaze steady, waiting. She was not a woman who expected pity. She was a woman who expected the next blow to fall. He decided not to cushion his own. He gestured vaguely towards the sleeping girls. "They need a woman's hand, someone to teach them, to mind them. The ranch takes all my time. More than all my time." He took a deep breath, the words feeling foreign and clumsy on his tongue. He laid out his reality as plainly as he knew how. The unending work, the loneliness, the fear for his daughter's future. He wasn't offering a romance or a life of ease. He was offering a roof, a meal, a purpose. He was offering a trade. He looked her square in the eye, his own gaze unflinching. And he made his offer, the one that had been solidifying in his mind for hours, a proposal as stark and stripped down as the winter landscape outside. "Looking for shelter?" he asked, the words hanging between them, raw and exposed. "My daughters need a mother." The third morning, the world was born anew. The wind had finally died, leaving behind a profound, muffled silence. The sun rose on a landscape transformed, a sea of pristine, sculpted white that glittered with a painful brilliance. The storm was over, but Alara's predicament remained. Her wagon was a half-buried wreck, and the thought of trying to get to Willow Creek on foot was suicide. Silas's offer, as shocking and unconventional as it was, echoed in the quiet cabin. It wasn't a proposal of the heart. It was a contract for survival. Her survival, and in a way, his family's. She had spent the night sleepless, staring into the dying embers of the fire, weighing her options. She had none. There was the freezing plains and certain death, or this cabin, this gruff, grieving man, and his two motherless daughters. She was a stranger, and he was offering her the most intimate of roles. It was terrifying, but the alternative was oblivion. When Silas rose before dawn to milk the cow, she was already awake, sitting in the chair, her hands clasped in her lap. She had made her decision. "I will stay," she said, her voice clear and steady in the pre-dawn gloom. "I will care for your daughters and your home. In exchange for my keep," she set the terms as plainly as he had, establishing the boundaries of their arrangement. This was a job, nothing more. Silas simply nodded, a muscle working in his jaw. "All right then," he said, and pulled on his boots. The deal was struck. The first few weeks were a delicate, awkward dance. Alara moved through the cabin with a quiet efficiency, her presence a constant, low hum where before there had been only jarring silence. She learned the rhythms of the household, Silas's early departures to the barn, Daisy's cheerful morning chatter, Lily's sullen moods. She began to impose a gentle order on the chaos. The mending pile shrank. The floor was swept clean. Meals appeared on the table at regular times, simple but nourishing. She didn't try to change anything fundamental. She simply smoothed the rough edges of their lives. Lily was her biggest challenge. The girl watched Alara with an unblinking, hostile gaze, her loyalty to her mother's memory a fierce, protective fire. She resisted Alara's every effort. If Alara tried to braid her hair, Lily would pull away, declaring, "Mama did it better." If Alara cooked a stew, Lily would push it around her plate and mutter that it wasn't the same. She was a small, formidable gatekeeper to the family's heart, and she had no intention of letting Alara pass. Alara did not push. She did not scold or plead. She simply endured the girl's coldness with a quiet, unyielding patience. She would set Lily's plate down without comment. She would lay a brush on the girl's bedside table and leave it there. She gave the girl space for her grief, understanding that it was a territory she had no right to invade. Daisy, on the other hand, became her shadow. The little girl followed her from room to room, a constant stream of questions and observations. It was Daisy who showed Alara where Mary had kept her sewing basket, a beautiful willow-woven thing filled with colorful threads. It was Daisy who led her to a small, hidden patch of winter-hardy herbs by the creek, herbs Mary had used for cooking and remedies. Through the younger child, Alara began to piece together a portrait of the woman whose place she was now occupying, but not filling. Mary had been warm and kind and loved this family with a ferocity that still echoed in the cabin walls. Silas remained a distant, watchful presence. He worked from sunup to sundown, his energy consumed by the endless demands of the ranch. He and Alara spoke mostly of practical matters, the dwindling supply of flour, a leak in the barn roof, the health of the livestock. Yet he noticed everything. He noticed the way the cabin smelled of baking bread now, a scent he hadn't realized he'd missed so desperately. He noticed the way Daisy's laughter seemed to come more easily. He noticed the neat stitches in his mended shirt, small and even, a testament to a care he hadn't experienced in years. He found himself watching Alara when she wasn't aware of it. He watched her patient hands guiding daisies as they formed letters in a tray of sand. He saw the soft expression on her face as she listened to the little girl's stories. He saw a strength in her that was as quiet and enduring as the ancient pines on a ridge. He had offered her shelter, a roof over her head. He was beginning to realize she was offering them something far more profound in return. She was offering them a semblance of home. A month after her arrival, the snow had melted enough for Silas to make the trip into the nearby town of Redemption for supplies. The town was little more than a dusty main street with a general store, a blacksmith, a church, and a saloon. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and speculation was the primary form of entertainment. He'd left Alara with a long list and a stern warning to keep the doors locked. The girls had clung to her, a fact that did not go unnoticed by Silas. Lily's grip was reluctant, but it was there. The moment he stepped into Gable's general store, he felt the shift in atmosphere. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face was perpetually pinched in a state of disapproval, stopped arranging a display of canned peaches and eyed him over her spectacles. "Silas," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Been a while. We were beginning to think you'd been snowed in for good." "Just busy, Martha," he said, heading for the flour barrels. "Busy, is it?" she pressed, following him. "Heard you have help." Out at the ranch, the word help was loaded with insinuation. News traveled fast, even from the most isolated ranches. A lone trapper must have passed by and seen a woman's silhouette in the window. Found a traveler stranded in the storm. Her wagon was wrecked, Silas said, keeping his voice even, his back to her as he scooped flour into a sack. "A traveler," Mrs. Gable repeated, savoring the word. "A woman. Alone. Staying out there with you. And those two innocent girls," she clucked her tongue. "People will talk, Silas. It's not proper." The Reverend Miller himself was saying he feels a visit is in order to ensure the children are in a godly environment. Silas's shoulders tensed. He finished with the flour, tied off the sack with a sharp tug, and finally turned to face her. His eyes were cold as chips of winter ice. "My children are fine. The woman is a decent person who I kept from freezing to death. My business is my own." His tone put an end to the questions, but not to the looks. As he gathered his supplies, he felt the eyes of the other customers on him. He saw the whispers behind cupped hands, the judgmental stares. He had always been a private man, keeping to himself even when Mary was alive. But now, his privacy was seen as a cover for something scandalous. He was being tried and convicted in the court of town gossip. He left the store with his jaw set, a cold anger churning in his gut. It wasn't for himself he was angry. It was for Alara. She had survived a blizzard only to be thrust into a storm of a different kind, one made of whispers and suspicion. And he had been the one to put her there. The ride home was long, the weight of the town's judgment heavier than any sack of flour. One evening, a few weeks later, a crisis erupted. Daisy, who had been listless all day, developed a raging fever. By nightfall, she was delirious, her small body burning hot to the touch, her breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. A terrifying panic seized Silas. It started the same way with Mary. A cough, a fever, then a swift, merciless decline. The memory was a raw, gaping wound, and seeing his youngest daughter in the grip of the same illness paralyzed him with a fear so profound it stole the air from his lungs. He stood by her bed, helpless, a giant of a man rendered useless by a child's fever. He didn't know what to do. The doctor was in redemption, a full day's ride away, impossible in the dark. It was Alara who took charge. Her earlier reserve vanished, replaced by a calm, focused competence that was nothing short of commanding. "Silas," she said, her voice firm but gentle, cutting through his panicked state. "Go fetch fresh, cold water from the well, and bring me the willow bark from the pantry, and lavender, the dried bunch hanging by the stove." He moved without question, grateful for the direction, for the sense that something could be done. While he was gone, Alara gently sponged Daisy's face and limbs with cool water, murmuring soft, soothing words to the delirious child. When Silas returned, she had him build up the fire. Then she set a small pot to boil, steeping the willow bark into a bitter tea to fight the fever and adding the lavender to calm the child's restless spirit. All through the long, dark night, they worked together, a silent, efficient team. They took turns bathing Daisy's forehead, forcing tiny sips of the willow tea and water between her parched lips. They sat side by side in the flickering firelight, their world shrunk to the small, feverish child in the bed. In the shared, desperate vigil, the walls between them began to crumble. He saw not just her capability, but her deep, genuine compassion. She cared for Daisy not as a duty, but as if the child were her own. At one point, in the deepest hour before dawn, Silas's composure broke. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with a silent, racking sob. "I can't lose her, too," he whispered, the words raw with grief and terror. Alara didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. She simply reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. Her touch was light, hesitant, yet it grounded him in the terrifying present. It was a simple gesture of shared humanity, an acknowledgement of his pain. They sat that way for a long time, a man and a woman, strangers bound by a common fear, guarding a small, precious life against the darkness. Even Lily was drawn into the circle of their efforts. She woke to the hushed activity and stood in the shadows, watching. She saw the terror on her father's face, and she saw Alara, tireless and gentle, tending to her little sister with a devotion that was absolute. She saw Alara murmuring the words to a soft lullaby, the same one their mother used to sing. The hostility in Lily's heart, so carefully nurtured, began to crack. In the face of real fear, of life and death, her resentment seemed small and petty. She crept to the bedside and took Daisy's hand, adding her own small presence to the vigil. Just as the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, the fever broke. Daisy's temperature began to drop, her breathing eased, and she fell into a deep, natural sleep. The relief in the room was a palpable thing, a collective, shuddering exhale. Silas slumped in his chair, utterly spent. Alara leaned her head back, her eyes closed, exhaustion etched on her face. Lily, still holding her sister's hand, looked from Daisy to Alara, and her expression was no longer one of suspicion, but of a dawning, reluctant gratitude. The crisis had passed, but something had fundamentally shifted in the small cabin. They had faced the darkness together, and in doing so, had become something more than a man, a woman, and two children living under the same roof. They had begun to feel like a family. In the weeks that followed Daisy's recovery, a new ease settled over the household. Lily's open hostility toward Alara softened into a wary truce, which then slowly blossomed into a hesitant affection. It began with small things. Lily started allowing Alara to brush her hair, sitting stiffly at first, then gradually relaxing into the rhythmic, gentle strokes. One afternoon, Alara was kneading dough for bread, her hands covered in flour, when she saw Lily watching her intently. "My mama used to let me help," Lily said quietly, her first voluntary offering of a memory. Alara's hands stilled. She looked at the girl, her heart aching with a mixture of sadness and hope. "Would you like to?" she asked softly. Lily nodded, a small, shy movement. Alara carved off a piece of dough for her, and they worked side by side at the big wooden table, the only sound the soft thud of dough being worked by 4 hands instead of 2. It was a bridge built of flour and yeast, a silent peace treaty. Silas found himself making excuses to be in the cabin more often. He'd come in to sharpen a tool or check a ledger, but he was really there to soak in the atmosphere of warmth and life that now filled the space. He'd listen to Alara's soft voice as she taught the girls their letters, or the sound of their laughter as she told them story. These were the sounds he'd thought were gone from his life forever. He and Alara began to talk more, their conversations moving beyond the practicalities of the ranch. One evening, as she sat mending one of Daisy's dresses, he asked her about her life before she came here. She was hesitant at first, her past a place she clearly did not like to revisit. But slowly, she opened up. She told him she was an orphan, raised in a cold, rigid institution in the East where affection was scarce and work was plentiful. Her journey west had been an escape, a desperate bid for a life of her own choosing. "I was never part of a family," she confessed, her eyes on her needlework. I don't rightly know how." "You seem to be a natural," Silas said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. Her hands paused, and she looked up at him, a flicker of surprise and something else, something vulnerable, in her eyes. "Your girls make it easy," she said simply, before returning to her sewing. But the moment of connection lingered in the air between them. He had seen behind her wall of reserve, and she had seen a flicker of the gentleness behind his gruff exterior. Their growing comfort was a fragile thing, a tender new plant in harsh soil. A trip to town served as a cruel reminder of just how harsh that soil was. They needed to trade some furs for salt, sugar, and other necessities, and Silas decided it was time for them all to go. He wanted to show the town they were a family unit, respectable and normal. He was naive to think it would be so simple. The moment their wagon rolled down Redemption's Main Street, the whispers started. Curtains twitched in windows. People stopped on the boardwalk to stare. Alara, sitting on the wagon bench beside Silas with Daisy on her lap and Lily beside her, felt the color drain from her face. She instinctively pulled the girls closer, trying to shield them from the barrage of hostile glances. Inside the general store, Mrs. Gable was icily polite, her disapproval a palpable force field around her. She addressed her comments only to Silas, pointedly ignoring Alara, as if she were invisible. But the worst was yet to come. As they were leaving, Reverend Miller appeared on the boardwalk, his face a mask of grim piety. He blocked their path, his gaze sweeping over them with open condemnation. "Brother Kane," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. "A word." Silas set his jaw. "Reverend, I have been meaning to visit your homestead," the preacher continued, his eyes fixing on Alara. "There is concern for the moral instruction of your children. This arrangement is an affront to decency. You are living in sin, man, and setting a terrible example for your flock and your daughters. Alara flinched as if struck. She felt shame wash over her, hot and suffocating. She was a scandal, a stain on this family she had come to care for so deeply. Before Silas could retort, a new voice cut in, sharp and condescending. Having trouble, Silas? It was Jedediah Harding, a wealthy, land-baron rancher whose property bordered Silas's. Harding was a vulture of a man, with a reputation for buying up smaller, struggling ranches for a fraction of their worth. He'd been trying to get his hands on Silas's land, with its valuable creek access, for years. He dismounted from his fine horse, a smug smile on his face as he took in the scene. "Seems you've got more than just cattle to manage these days," Harding said, his eyes lingering on Alara in a way that made her skin crawl. "Perhaps you're overwhelmed. Perhaps it's time you consider my offer for your land. A man with your complications could use the cash. Start fresh somewhere else." The threat was clear. Harding was using the town's gossip, amplified by the Reverend's public condemnation, as a weapon. Silas felt a cold rage building inside him. These men were passing judgment on a woman they didn't know, threatening a family they didn't understand, all for their own selfish ends. The preacher for his self-righteous authority, Harding for his greed. Silas put a protective hand on Lily's shoulder and looked from the Reverend to Harding. His voice, when he spoke, was low and dangerous. "My family and my land are not for sale. Not now, not ever. You do well to remember that." Without another word, he helped Alara and the girls back onto the wagon and drove away, leaving the preacher sputtering and Harding smiling, knowing he had found a new, powerful lever to use against his neighbor. The ride home was silent, the small joys of their morning shattered. Alara stared straight ahead, her face pale and set, the humiliation of the encounter wrapped around her like a shroud. Silas's anger simmered, directed not only at the town, but at himself. He had brought this on her. He had offered her shelter, but he had failed to protect her from the storm of human cruelty. The fragile home they had been building together suddenly felt terribly exposed, vulnerable to the predators circling outside. The confrontation in town cast a long shadow over the ranch. The tentative ease between Silas and Alara was replaced by a renewed tension, born not of awkwardness, but of shared anxiety. Alara grew quieter, more withdrawn, as if trying to make herself smaller, less of a target. She moved through her days with the same efficiency, but the light in her eyes had dimmed. She was constantly aware of her position, of the scandal she represented. The shame the Reverend had so publicly heaped upon her had found its mark. Silas was consumed by a slow-burning fury and a gnawing sense of helplessness. Harding's threat had been clear. The town's judgment was now a tool in the man's greedy hands. Every strange rider he saw in the distance, every shadow at dusk, made him tense, wondering if it was Harding or one of his men coming to make trouble. He felt a fierce, primal protectiveness for Alara and his girls that went far beyond his initial, practical arrangement. They were his. This life they were building was his, and he would not let men like Harding and Miller tear it apart. The pressure mounted a week later. The circuit judge was due to pass through redemption, and Harding made his move. He sent one of his ranch hands with a message for Silas. It wasn't a letter, just a verbal warning delivered with a sneer. "Mr. Harding says to tell you the judge will be in town on Saturday," the man said, not bothering to dismount. "He says the Reverend is mighty concerned about the welfare of your girls. Says a judge might be inclined to listen to a man of God and a man of property. Mr. Harding says his offer for your land still stands. A quick sale might make all this unpleasantness go away." The deadline was set. Saturday, less than a week away. Harding was threatening to use the law itself to strip him of everything: his daughters, his home, the very legacy he was fighting to preserve. The threat of having Lily and Daisy declared wards of the church or the state, taken from him and sent to an orphanage like the one Alara had described, was a horror beyond imagining. That evening, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken fear. The girls, sensitive to the mood, were quiet and subdued. After they were put to bed, Silas and Alara sat at the table, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Silas spoke, his voice strained. He's going to do it. Harding. He'll get the preacher to lie to the judge. They'll say I'm an unfit father. They'll use you as the reason. He looked at her, his face a mask of anguish. They'll take my girls, Alara. Alara looked at her hands, resting on the worn wood of the table. She had spent her whole life being powerless, subject to the whims of others. She had come here seeking only shelter, a place to exist without being a burden. But in this small cabin, with this broken family, she had found something she hadn't even known she was searching for, a place to belong. The thought of being the cause of its destruction was unbearable. I can leave, she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. If I'm gone, they'll have no reason. No, Silas cut her off, his voice sharp. He reached across the table and, for the first time, took her hand. His grip was strong, desperate. No, you leaving is not the answer. You leaving, that would be letting them win. That would be tearing this family apart just as surely as they want to. He looked down at their joined hands, his large, calloused, and stained with the earth of his ranch. Hers, smaller, scarred from a different kind of labor, but just as strong. In that moment, the truth of his feelings, a truth he had been avoiding for weeks, became blindingly clear. His offer, born of practicality, had become a matter of the heart. This woman was not a housekeeper. She was not just a caretaker for his children. She had become his partner in every way that mattered. She had brought his home, and him, back to life. When I found you in that storm, he said, his voice low and intense, I was just a man trying to survive. So were you. We were both just looking for shelter from the cold. But you did more than find shelter here, Alara. You built a home. For Lily. For Daisy. For me, he paused, his gaze holding hers, raw and honest. I can't imagine this place without you. I don't want to. He took a deep breath, the next words representing a leap of faith greater than any he had ever taken. There is one way to silence them, to protect the girls and this ranch. One way to show them we are not something to be judged, but a family to be recognized. He tightened his grip on her hand. Marry me, Alara, he said, the words a quiet explosion in the small room. Not as a contract, not for propriety's sake. Marry me. Let's make this real. A real family. Let's stand together, not as a rancher and his hired help, but as husband and wife. Alara stared at him, her heart pounding against her ribs. Tears welled in her eyes, tears not of sorrow or fear, but of a profound, overwhelming emotion she couldn't name. In her whole life, no one had ever stood for her. No one had ever chosen her. He was offering her not just a name and protection, but a place at his side. He was offering her a love as quiet and sturdy as he was, a love built not on flowery words, but on shared vigils and common purpose, and the simple, profound act of holding a hand in the dark. She thought of the cold orphanage, of the lonely years, of the terrifying blizzard. And she thought of the warmth of this hearth, the sound of Daisy's laughter, the slow dawning trust in Lily's eyes, and the steadfast presence of the man sitting across from her. He was her shelter, and she realized was his. Yes, she whispered, the word to release a promise. Yes, Silas, I will. The decision was made. They would not wait for Harding and the judge to come to them. They would go to town on Saturday morning, walk into the courthouse, and file for a marriage license in front of everyone. They would face the storm head-on, together. It was a terrifying prospect, a public declaration that would invite the very judgment they feared. But it was also an act of defiance, a claim on their own lives, their own happiness. They would no longer hide. The next few days were fraught with a nervous energy. They told the girls their plan in simple terms. Alara and I are going to be married, Silas said, kneeling so he was at their level. So she can stay with us always. So we can be a proper family. Daisy clapped her hands in delight. Will she be our new mama? Alara's breath hitched. She looked at Lily, whose expression was complex, a mixture of uncertainty and something that looked like relief. Lily didn't say anything, but she walked over to Alara and, for the first time, initiated a hug, wrapping her thin arms around Alara's waist. The gesture spoke more than words ever could. It was an acceptance, a blessing. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold. The sky was a vast, unforgiving blue. They dressed in their best, though humble, clothes. Alara wore a simple gray dress she had mended herself, and Silas wore a clean shirt, his face scrubbed and his hair slicked down. The girls wore matching blue ribbons in their hair, ribbons Alara had saved from a small bolt of cloth. They looked like a family. As they climbed into the wagon, a quiet resolve settled over them. They were 4 people against a town, armed with nothing but the truth of their bond. The ride to redemption was tense. Silas drove the team with a steady hand, his knuckles white on the reins. Alara sat beside him, her back straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The girls were nestled between them, sensing the gravity of the day. As they turned onto the main street, it was just as they had feared. It seemed the entire town was out. Harding had made sure of it. He stood on the boardwalk in front of the saloon, flanked by Reverend Miller and a handful of his cronies. Mrs. Gable was positioned strategically on the steps of her store, her arms crossed. It was a gauntlet of judgment. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the small clapboard building that served as the courthouse and land office. He got down and then turned to help Alara. As his hands circled her waist to lift her down, he paused, his eyes meeting hers. Together, he murmured a vow and a prayer. Together, she answered, her voice steady. He lifted her down, and then the girls. He took Alara's hand in one of his and Lily's in the other. Alara took Daisy's hand. They stood for a moment, a small, united front. Then, they began to walk toward the courthouse steps. Harding stepped forward to block their path, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his face. Well, Silas decided to come to town to face the music? The judge is inside. He's very interested to hear what the Reverend has to say about the moral character of your household. Reverend Miller stepped up beside him, his face severe. This charade ends today, Cain. We are here to save those children from this den of iniquity. The Lord's work must be done. The crowd murmured, their faces a mixture of curiosity and condemnation. Alara felt a tremor of her old fear. The shame was a physical thing, a tightening in her chest. She wanted to shrink, to disappear. But then she felt Silas's hand tighten on hers, and the small, trusting grip of Daisy's hand in her other. She was not alone. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. Silas looked not at Harding, but at the faces in the crowd, people he had known his whole life, people who had known his father, who had watched him grow up. There is no iniquity in my home, Reverend, Silas said, his voice ringing with a calm authority that cut through the murmurs. There is only decency and care. This woman, Alara, saved my daughter's life when she was sick with a fever. This woman has taught my girls to read and to laugh again. She has turned my house back into a home. Lies and justifications, the Reverend boomed. You are living with this woman, outside the bonds of matrimony. She is a stranger, a vagrant you took in. What do you know of her past? Of her character? It was then that Lily, who had been standing silently, her face pale, let go of her father's hand. She stepped forward, placing herself between her family and the accusers. She was just a small girl in a simple dress, but her stance was one of fierce defiance. She looked directly at Reverend Miller. You're wrong, she said, her voice small but clear as a bell. Alara isn't a vagrant. She sings Mama's songs to us. She makes Mama's stew, and she let me help with the bread. When Daisy was sick, she stayed up all night. She held my hand. She's not wicked. She's kind. A stunned silence fell over the street. The simple, irrefutable testimony of a child had more power than all the preacher's bluster. Mrs. Gable had the decency to look down at her shoes. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. The weapon of shame had been turned back on the accusers. Harding, seeing his advantage slipping away, sneered. A child's words. It changes nothing. The arrangement is improper. The judge will see that. Silas pulled Alara forward until she stood beside him, facing the crowd together. He put his arm around her waist, a public act of possession and protection. His voice, when he spoke again, held no anger, only an unshakable, quiet conviction that was more powerful than any shout. My arrangement, as you call it, is my own affair, but so that your small minds can rest. Know this, he looked down at Alara, his expression softening with a love and respect that was plain for all to see. This woman is the heart of my family. Her name is Alara Vance, and she has done me the great honor of agreeing to become my wife. He turned his gaze back to the crowd, to Harding and the Reverend, his eyes like steel. Your judgment means less to me than the dust on my boots. We are a family. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have an appointment with the judge to file our marriage license. He did not wait for a response. Holding fast to Alara and his daughters, he walked forward. The crowd parted before them like the Red Sea. Harding and the Reverend were left standing in the street, their faces masks of stunned fury, their power broken by the simple, unassailable truth. Silas led his family up the steps of the courthouse and through the door, leaving the whispers and the judgment of the town behind them. Inside the dusty, sun-drenched office, the judge, a weary-looking man with kind eyes, listened patiently. He had heard the commotion outside. He looked from Silas's determined face to Alara's quiet dignity, to the two little girls who stood close to her, their trust in her absolute. He listened to Silas's formal request, then stamped the papers with a decisive thud. He slid the license across the desk. Congratulations, Mr. Kane. Ma'am. He gave them a small, knowing smile. It seems to me those children are in fine hands. Walking back out into the sunlight felt like stepping into a different world. The crowd had mostly dispersed. Harding and the Reverend were gone. A few of the townspeople who remained looked at them differently now. One farmer, a man Silas had known for years, met his eye and gave him a slow, deliberate nod of respect. The tide of opinion had turned. They walked to the wagon, the silence between them no longer tense, but filled with a profound and peaceful relief. The battle was over. They had won. Silas helped Alara and the girls into the wagon, and as he took his seat beside her, he reached over and took her hand. He didn't say anything, just laced his fingers through hers, a simple, solid promise that they were in this together, now and for always. The journey back to the ranch was the opposite of the journey in. The air was light, the future stretching before them as wide and blue as the sky above. Daisy chattered happily, while Lily leaned her head against Alara's shoulder, a gesture of complete and trusting affection. That night, after a celebratory dinner of roasted chicken, a rare treat, and with the girls tucked soundly in their beds, Silas and Alara stood on the small porch of the cabin. A blanket of stars was strewn across the infinite dark, more brilliant than she had ever seen. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and cold earth. The landscape that had once seemed so threatening, so full of peril, now looked beautiful, peaceful. It was their home. Silas stood behind her and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into his warmth, his solidity. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the stars, listening to the quiet night sounds of the ranch. I never knew a home could feel like this, Alara whispered into the stillness. So safe. It wasn't, Silas said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. Not until you came. He turned her gently in his arms to face him. In the faint starlight, he could see the soft curve of her smile, the light in her eyes. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that was not born of passion or haste, but of deep, quiet gratitude and a love that had grown slowly, surely, in the hardest of soils. It was a kiss that sealed every promise they had made, spoken and unspoken. The widower's desperate offer of shelter had been answered, not by a servant or a caretaker, but by a partner, a wife, a mother. In saving her, he had saved himself. And together, under the vast and watchful sky, they had finally, truly, found their way home. The sun rises on a new day at the Kane Ranch. There's a quiet rhythm to the morning, a sense of peace that has settled deep into the bones of the old cabin. Silas stands by the window, a mug of hot coffee in his hand, watching the first golden light spill over the eastern ridges. The world outside is still and beautiful. Inside, he hears the soft sounds of his family waking up, the low murmur of Alara's voice, the giggle of his youngest daughter. He turns, and the sight that greets him fills the last empty corners of his heart. Alara is sitting on the edge of the girl's bed, expertly braiding Lily's long, dark hair, her fingers moving with a practiced, gentle rhythm. Daisy is curled at her side, chattering away about a dream she had. The scene is so simple, so ordinary, yet it's everything he ever lost, everything he never thought he'd have again. He watches her hum as she finishes the braid, her face soft in the morning light, and he knows he did more than offer shelter from a storm. He found the anchor for his soul. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.